right, we'll go ahead and get started. I made a bit of a mess of the coffee, but we'll clean that up once it cools down a bit. So, yeah, they just saw how messy I made it. I don't know what I did. Oh well. We today are going to be looking at the Fifth Ecumenical Council, the Second Council of Constantinople from 553 AD. Now, for a lot of for our Anglican tradition has often seen this more as a footnote to the previous council, to number 4. We'll see why. So let's quickly, before we get into the issues for this council, let's review everything we've done since Nicaea. So review some of those dogmas that get articulated through the fourth council, the Council of Chalcedon. So from Nicaea 1, First Council of Nicaea in 325, and First Council of Constantinople in 381, we really hammered out the doctrine of the Trinity in a way that that articulation really has stood the test of time. It hasn't really changed since then, not among general orthodoxy. And what we say there is that we have one God who eternally exists in 3 distinct persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So the terminology that comes from these 2 councils is there is one ousia, one substance, one essence, but there are 3 hypostases. And we say that, and then from Ephesus in 431, we hammered out that the Son is one unified person. There is but one person of the Son, one hypostasis of the Son. But since the incarnation, and this is what Chalcedon hammered out in 451, we can say that the Son has 2 distinct natures. So one person, but 2 natures, a fully divine nature of the substance of his Father, a fully human nature of the substance of his mother. Now, that was, again, 451. You notice that this council is over 100 years later. We haven't had that kind of space between councils yet. They've all been within a generation or 2, but here we actually are moving a full 100 years later. And part of what's happening is the Council of Chalcedon was not received by everybody. And in fact, the Church of Alexandria left the rest of the church over Chalcedon. To this day, the Coptic church, the people headquarters out of Alexandria, are still in schism with the rest of the church because they did not accept this idea that there are 2 separate natures, 2 distinct is probably better than separate, 2 distinct natures within the one person. Because to them, the way they understand it, saying 2 natures really means 2 persons, and that doesn't make any sense, right? So they left the church, and what we're going to see in the next 2 councils is these attempts at trying to bring the church back together. So we have this controversy and schism over Chalcedon. It's lingering debates over Chalcedon in Egypt, and to a lesser extent Syria, because some of the Syrian church had problems with the one unified person issue, because to them that sounded like it was some new thing rather than keeping Jesus as God. And at the same time, we've talked about this. So we've got this lingering schism, controversy over Chalcedon, largely centered in Egypt and Syria, but we also have resentment building because those are still part of the Eastern Empire. The emperor is in Constantinople, and Constantinople not only is throwing its weight around civilly with the emperor being there, but the Patriarch of Constantinople is now basically saying, you know what, we're the new Rome, I'm the head, I'm the top dog in the church. And Egypt and Syria are not real happy with that. You remember that up until, just about 100 years prior, Antioch and Alexandria, Syria and Egypt, they were the big dogs of the church in the East. And so they're not real happy about that. Well, in 476, so again, this is about a generation, 20 years, 25 years after Chalcedon, the Emperor Zeno, he decides on his imperial power, he's going to just annul the Council of Chalcedon. He's like, this never happened. We're all going to go back to the way things were before. Bishop of Rome, Pope Felix III, he says, you do not have authority to do that. You're the emperor. You're not a bishop. You don't have authority over the church to do that. And this ends up creating a schism between Constantinople and Rome from 476 to 519. So we think that that big schism that happens in 1054, it's not the first time that happened. That's the one that lasts the longest, but it's not the first time that happened. So in 527, so we're about, 50 years after Zeno annulled Chalcedon. In 527, and this is a few years after Rome and Constantinople healed the schism, Justinian is crowned as the emperor. And he says, if I'm going to be the emperor, I need to have a united empire. Otherwise, I'm not really an emperor. And that means it's my duty to try to get everybody on the same page, politically and doctrinally. Otherwise, this is going to all fall apart. And so he decrees that all the bishops must subscribe to Chalcedon. He says, nope, this is something that you all agreed to. You must subscribe to that. But he says, we're going to have another council to work out these lingering differences. We're going to work this out. We're not just going to do this by fiat. We're going to do this together. And so he starts promoting the ideas of a fellow named Leonidas of Byzantium. And Leonidas was a defender of Chalcedon against various heresies. And he proposes this compromise idea that the human nature is hypostasized of the human nature into the divine nature. Basically, he's saying, the nature of Christ's human nature is kind of subsists within that divine nature. And he says, I think this can be a good compromise position that maintains the distinction of natures, but the one unified person, one unified hypostasis. And this might satisfy both the folks in Alexandria and the folks in Antioch, the moderates, not the crazies, but everybody else. And so this is kind of his reasoning. He says, okay, as everybody agrees, a nature must have its own hypostasis, its own personal existence. How can we say there are two natures but one hypostasis, two natures, one person? He says that's really the core of the debate. And so he says, the Alexandrians have a point that the eternal Logos, God the Son, the eternal Word, the Word, the divine Word, is the subject of the incarnation. That is, he's the one who becomes incarnate, is God the Son. So the personality, if you want to use that word, of Jesus is God the Son. And he says all the Alexandrians agree with this. This is something that we do agree with. But he says the Alexandrians are wrong because they're saying that they think that the humanity of Christ is impersonal. So that human nature doesn't have its own personhood at all. He says it just doesn't have a personhood. It's impersonal. Cyril of Alexandria had called this the anhypostasia of the human nature. There is no personhood to it at all. And he says that's wrong because if you don't have a personhood, you don't have a hypostasis within that nature, that's just an abstraction. That's just an idea. It doesn't mean anything. He says, so does this then imply that we're going to have to go back to what the Apollinarians were saying, that there are two persons, two hypostases, one for each nature? He says, no, because while each nature does need a personhood, it doesn't have to have its own personhood. And so he says that it can be hypostasized in another nature. So he says the human nature of Christ is not without a hypostasis, but it became hypostatic in the person of the Logos, the person of God the Son. So the human nature of Christ is not impersonal, nor personal in itself, but it's personalized within the person of the divinity. Does this sound very confusing and very philosophical? Yeah. I mean, it really is. This is very heady stuff. But and I was just reading the other day, a book, one of kind of the classic in Anglican theology on commentaries on the articles, and he said, you get to a point in some of the academic approach to theology where you just lose the plot. And he uses some of the controversies happening after Chalcedon as an example of that. But try to follow this a little bit though. This isn't out of left field, because here's what happens if his human nature is completely impersonal? Is that truly a human nature? It's not, right? But if it has its own person, then you've got two persons existing in Christ, and that's not right either, right? Right. Yeah, Christ is not, bipolar or schizophrenic or anything like that. There's not two persons. And so he says, okay, think about this. There's three ways he says that things could be united. Either you've got a really, really close relationship, like a friendship or a marriage. And he says this is what the Antiochians were doing when they were advocating Nestorianism. There's two natures, there's two persons. They're just so close that they're sharing one body. He says that's one way things could be united. He says there's another way things could be united, where if you kind of blend them into a third thing or into a hybrid. And he says that's what the Alexandrians were doing with Eutychianism, with Monophysitism, is they were making one hybrid nature, one person, one hybrid nature in one person. He says there's a third way. And the third way is they could be united so closely that their distinct natures subsist in a single existence. And he says that's how the incarnation of Christ is. He says, he compares it to a flame and wood being united by fire on the torch. You could probably poke holes in that analogy, but that's what he's saying. So he says, Jesus' human nature is exactly like unfallen humanity. But it doesn't have independent existence apart from God the Son himself, the divine Logos, the second person of the Trinity. So Jesus was, is, and always will be the second person of the Trinity, but that second person of the Trinity took on a human nature, joining it with his divine nature forevermore. That's what Leonidas is advocating. So this brings us then in 553 to the Second Council of Constantinople. Emperor Justinian, he calls it. It's presided over by Eutychius, the Patriarch of Constantinople. The other three Eastern patriarchs are present, even though they're in schism. They're present. I'm good, thank you. The Pope, Pope of Rome. This is a new guy by this time, Vigilius. He refuses to attend, but he does issue. Oh, and not only does he refuse to attend, he issues a document forbidding them to proceed without him. He says, "Without me, you guys can't do this," and they do it anyway. You get 152 bishops total attend. That's a lot lower than the previous councils. Only 16 of those 152 were from the West. And what's happening at the council is that they're really explaining these ideas from Leonidas of the one of the human nature being hypostasized, in-personed, if you can use that word, in God, in his divine nature. So that's really what's happening at the council. And they also end up condemning some previous theologians. They condemn the writings of Theodore of Mopsuestia, who lived at the end of the 4th century, beginning of the 5th, so 350 to 428. Some of Theodoret of Cyrus's writings they condemn, and he lived 393 to 458. They condemn a letter from Ebus of Edessa to Maris. I don't even know who that is. 435 to to 457. And all three of these guys that they condemn, they're dead. They've been dead for over 100 years. And they're also all from Antioch. They do additionally condemn Origen, who was even dead longer. Origen was a end of the 2nd century, beginning of the 3rd century writer from Alexandria, and they condemn him too. So ultimately, this doesn't bring back the people that had left. It doesn't work. In part, a lot of those places in Egypt and in Syria, they were fighting the Muslim invasion at the time. So for them, this was not really a high priority anyway. That's probably the biggest reason why it didn't really move them at all, because they've kind of got bigger fish to fry. Their very existence is being threatened by Islam at this time. And this ends up being almost entirely an Eastern debate, the churches of the East, Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, Jerusalem. However, the Roman Church does, despite the Pope forbidding them to go forward with it, does eventually accept it. I don't really know what the timeline on that was either. In the ACNA, what we end up doing is we affirm the Christological clarifications. And so we'll put a bookmark there because we need to come back to make sure that we understand what all that means. And to be perfectly honest, many Protestants can't follow the issue and don't really care. Like, it's just too philosophical for a lot of folks. You know, it's you know, how are you working all this out? What does it even matter? It seems like you're going beyond what Scripture requires because you're trying to work this out in terms of your philosophical model rather than biblically. That's the Second Council of Constantinople. So what is the Christological clarification we get from this? And that is that the personhood of the Lord's human nature is in the divine nature. That the personhood of Jesus as the man was always the person of the second person of the Trinity. That's really the Christological clarification. This isn't a third thing. This isn't two natures. This isn't some weird blending. But we already got that from Chalcedon, didn't we? So it doesn't really add a whole lot of new. It just kind of clarifies philosophically how we might articulate that. Let's throw this out for questions, comments. Did any of that make any sense whatsoever, or was it just so esoteric that it's like, what is this even all about? Yeah. Why are we studying this here? Okay, so those first four councils, those were the things that really, really matter for us as Anglicans. I did want to briefly hit the next two, which are a lot more confusing, this one and next week, because we do mention them in the ACNA mentions them in the fundamental declarations in terms of those Christological clarifications. And you will find a lot of people that want to go to the mat over whether to affirm 7 ecumenical councils or not in the Anglican world. I guarantee you most of the people going to the mat over that have never actually studied these last few councils. This is a very heady thing. This particular council, for a lot of folks in the Western world, period, it just doesn't really matter. But I do think understanding this distinction of the three ways that things could be united here, that's very helpful. Does it add anything to what we had last time? Probably not for us. Bob?
We take everything you said, everything that's stated in the Apostles' Creed, everything that's stated in the Nicene Creed, on faith.
Yeah.
Just like the currency of the United States, it's based on faith. The $20 bill that I have is worth about 2 cents of 1 cent.
In its materials, yeah, sure.
It's not based on the full faith and credit. What good is it? You know, it's
Yeah.
the same thing with our Christian faith. I was taught this way, I was raised. So,
Yeah.
so when you bring up the Athanasian Creed, when I read it 3 times and I said, whatever you say, and put it aside.
Sure. So that does bring up a very good point. This goes far beyond what we see in the Apostles' Creed in particular. And it goes beyond what we see in the Nicene Creed. A lot of what's in the Athanasian Creed it kind of touches on. You'll notice in our American Prayer Book we don't have the Athanasian Creed. What is it that you are required in your baptismal vows to affirm? Not a rhetorical question.
Well, one of the things is
Yeah, creedally, when in our baptismal vows we say you need to believe the articles of the Christian faith. The substance is the Trinity, but specifically, what are they saying? What are they saying? The stuff that the way it's outlined. Well, it's specifically the baptismal creed is the Apostles' Creed, the simplest of the three. Why might it be? Why might it be the simplest of the three, the one that we say, basic baptismal assent, affirmed, reaffirmed in your confirmation. This is what it means if you're going to be a communicant in good standing in this church. Why might it be that the Apostles' Creed is the one? Now we certainly confess the Nicene Creed every week, but the one we're supposed to understand is the Apostles' Creed. Why might that be? It can be affirmed by anyone. Any Christian should be able to affirm that. We're not requiring you as a communicant in this church to get this philosophical stuff that most of our clergy don't get either, don't understand, right? I would go so far as to say that almost nobody today really gets the significance of any of that philosophically. We might be able to understand it, but it's so beyond our frame of reference in the way we think. It doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't produce the reaction that it would for the original audience. And even then, you can see that. Why was there schism? Were the Alexandrians actually heretics? Probably not. They probably just didn't understand what was being said. And that's part of why we do want to look at these later ones. It's because we want to see what happens when we start to kind of over systematize a little bit. Like the schisms that happen after Chalcedon, they never heal. And why is that? Well, on the one hand, because there's a lot of political baggage that goes with it. It's not just about the theology, it's also about these two powers fighting each other within the church. But also, it's that at this point you're starting to go beyond what you can really defend from Scripture.
I'm just looking at the Apostles' Creed in the 19th prayer book, and it doesn't make anything outlandish. It's very concise statement of the Christian belief.
The Apostles' Creed is very concise. I have a friend who calls it Trinitarian minimalism, but he's not saying that in a bad way. Like, to him, that's actually a good thing, because it's a generous orthodoxy that historically Christians everywhere, always, and at all times, could believe. Yeah, essentialism might be better than minimalism. We are going to spend some weeks during Trinity Tide, going through. I want to go through actually preach through the Apostles' Creed, the Lord's Prayer, and the Ten Commandments during regular service, and we're going to start with the Apostles' Creed. But one of the reasons why that's important is because of this essentialism. So this question of why do the things that happen in this second council even really matter? That's a very good question. Now, I would say, as someone that digs into these things, I think it's very fascinating. I think they made the right call. But do I think this is something that everybody needs to understand? Heck no. It really does go beyond. It's beginning to get into the. It's getting into the weeds. It's getting into the weeds. So what should we be getting from? And we're going to see something similar with the next one. Although I do think that the next one gets onto some issues where we do have some direct experience with some of the consequences of not getting the next one. Only in terms of another really weird debate that happened to happen within Protestantism over the last 10 years. But here, I think here's the important thing, is just when we look back at what we talked about last week in Chalcedon and before that in Ephesus, that we have one unified person who has two distinct natures. What this really does is say that that human nature is a real human nature, but it's not a separate human person. And that's important. That's important. I don't think we need to go through everything they went through to get there. But I do think that is important. Randy.
Well, this sort of for me, I'm following along history. I enjoy the history.
Yeah.
And what's going on, back and forth. But it's coming and bringing it to today. And I think I kind of brought this up a little bit, but there's still remnants out there. The Orthodox Church, in the Middle East especially.
Oh yeah.
Egypt and so forth, Syria. Are they relevant? Is there really something?
Yeah.
They are relevant. These other movements that are going on, there's the Levant, and so like other things going on that seem to have life to it. Will it merge? Some things come together, and so I kind of.
So if you go to Egypt and you can find Christians in Egypt, chances are they're going to be Coptic Christians, most likely. Almost certainly. Kind of like if you just go pull 10 Christians off the street in San Antonio, you're going to have either a majority Catholic or majority Baptist, right? Everybody else is going to be a minority. Chances are you're going to run to a Baptist or a Catholic, right? That in Egypt, even more so, that's the case for the Coptic Church. In Greece, almost all the Christians in Greece are Greek Orthodox. In Russia, almost all the Christians there are Russian Orthodox. So there are parts of the world that we just haven't had a lot of interaction with historically, where these groups are still the majority groups. The problem is some of them have been so overrun by Islam that they're almost dead. The Christians in Israel, I would say the majority of them are Eastern Rite. I don't know because some of those folks are now in communion with the Pope. They've come into communion with the Pope. So I'm not sure exactly if, which group but they are going to look like these Eastern guys.
Where does Messianic?
They're like almost nothing. Yeah, the Messianic Jews are a super, super minority of a super minority.
The Eastern would be even greater than Messianic.
Far greater, yes, far greater. The Eastern Christians are the most Christians you have in the Holy Land. But they're under 1% now. 5 years ago, they were still at 2%. Like it's just been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And part of that, the Holy Land, it's not so much Islam, although it is, but it's Islam and Judaism. It's just a terrible place to live if you're a Christian. And a lot of these ancient homes of the church have become that way, where people that actually want their families to survive and thrive, they're like, this is our home, but how can we stay here? And there are some of them that it's been taken away. And we could get into the weeds on this when it comes to the Holy Land itself. I don't want to, because it's very complex. But these are problems, and we don't see that here. But these people are still around. They're still important. And what you do find is that in these places where they are such a huge minority, some of these issues that cause these schisms, okay, you're a regular Christian on the street, like, okay, we get it. We're not in communion with Rome anymore. We haven't been for 1,000 years. But this guy's a Christian like me, right? A lot of these issues kind of fall to the side when we sometimes call this grassroots ecumenism. And the same thing, one of our tour guides when we were in Greece, because she's a good Greek Orthodox, she wouldn't take communion with us, but she was really apologetic for it. She's like, and we're like, what, you can take it with us. If your conscience tells you, because she's basically, my church tells me no, so I'm not going to do it, but I really wish I could. And that's pretty typical, right? Our tour guide in Israel, she's Greek Catholic and she does whatever she wants because she deals with Christians of all sorts, right?
Believe in the real question.
Yeah.
Be able to take communion in a Christian church.
Yeah. Well, hey, we're about a minute over time, but the big thing is this does put a little bit of clarification on the person and nature issue. Next week we're going to see something a little bit more relevant, but the fire will really hit the fan in 3 weeks when we get to the Council on Icons. So that'll be fun. I'll see y'all in Mass or next week, as the case may be.